Well, hello everybody. My name is Stephen Mao. I'm the founder of Inclusion Advocate, and I'm so honored to be here today to speak with Professor McFaul, Ambassador McFaul, about public service, diplomacy, and activism for young people. And Professor McFaul, welcome to our program.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Let's start with your just extraordinary work as a diplomat. One fairly visible component of diplomacy is having face-to-face meetings with foreign leaders, foreign diplomats, but behind the scenes, all the preparation work that goes into these meetings, we imagine is just as crucial, just as important. Back in 2011, you traveled to Moscow with then Vice President Biden to meet with Russian President Medvedev, and during the meeting, to the surprise of the world, Russia agreed to abstain on UN Security Council Resolution 1973 authorizing no-fly zone over Libya to protect civilians. We're wondering, what are some of the preparation work that goes into a meeting like this with such a high order, with such a tall order to discuss?
Well, that's a great question. And I want to preface my answer by reminding everybody that I am not a professional diplomat. I am a professional professor. I've been a professor for most of my life, but I did have 5 years, terrific 5 years, fantastic 5 years of public service, where I worked 3 years at the White House with President Obama and Vice President Biden at the National Security Council, and then 2 years out in Moscow as the ambassador. And that trip was a very memorable trip. I usually traveled with the president at the time, right? But every now and then there were trips that the vice president took that I went on with him. And that was one. And, it gets to a philosophy about meetings where when I was in the government, we wanted to use these high-level meetings to achieve results. In the State Department, they're called deliverables. And so you use the meeting to force activity up to the meeting to get done before you meet. Not everybody believes that. Other people believe you need to have lots of meetings first, get to know each other, establish a rapport, and then you get on to trying to get things done. But in the Obama administration, we use these high-level meetings for very concrete purposes. And then the meeting you're describing, that was by far and away the most concrete outcome that we wanted. We wanted some signal that the Russians would abstain on those Security Council resolutions. To remind your viewers, because it's ancient history now, it's a decade ago, at that moment in time, spring of 2011, Gaddafi was threatening to commit what we thought would be a genocidal slaughter of Libyans living in the city of Benghazi. Now, it's been controversial whether that was a correct assessment or not, but I can tell you, working at the White House at the time, that's what we thought. And so we thought we should try to stop that, and even including using military force. But Obama was not going to do that without the blessing of the UN Security Council. He believes in multilateral institutions, and we weren't going to go it alone. And remember, he had criticized President Bush for going it alone in Iraq. And so a precondition of that military force was to get the entire UN Security Council resolution team to agree. And it was our assessment that if we got the Russians to agree, the Chinese would go along with them. And so you're right. There was a lot of preparation about how to spell that out, the argumentation for it. And remember, Vice President Biden back then usually did not meet with Medvedev. He was in charge of other countries. Obama was usually the point person for Russia. But he walked into that meeting. I was the only other person in the room, by the way. I was the note taker in the Kremlin. It was a pretty dramatic moment. And within 5 minutes, it was clear that Medvedev had done his homework too, that he had made this assessment, and he signaled to us that he wasn't going to vote for the resolution. That was too far, but he was going to abstain, and that allowed the resolution to go through. By the way, usually in these meetings, you have more people than just one other person, right? I was the note taker. And it was even strange that I was a note taker because the senior guy on the trip after the president at that time, his name is Tony Blinken. He's now the Secretary of State, by the way. And Tony said, no, Mike, you go in and do it. You speak Russian. You'll have a better feel for this meeting. And that's why I was in the room. But Medvedev didn't want a lot of people in the room either, because including his own foreign minister, because he knew that lots of people did not support that decision. And that's why he wanted the small meeting.
Understood. And a year after that meeting in 2012, you officially became the US ambassador to Russia. As you mentioned in your book, From Cold War to Hot Peace, as ambassador, you not only engaged with the government in Moscow, but also members of civil society, and including opposition leaders and opposition activists. You've long been a champion of practical idealism, which is the title of your forthcoming book this year. What do you think were some of the practical values for meeting with opposition activists? Does that create obstacles for your work and also their work, considering that they might be accused of receiving instruction from the West, as many NTV actually did so at the time?
Right. Yeah. Great question. First, I want to underscore one of the things I loved about being in the government is you're part of a team. Academia, writing books. I'm writing a book now. Thanks for plugging all my books, by the way. From Cold War to Hot Peace is still available, and the next one will be coming out next year. But for my academic work, not all academic work is this way, but my academic work is usually me just sitting alone with my computer and research materials. What I loved about government service, and for those of you interested, I highly recommend it, was being on a team, and therefore we were doing collective decisions. We had a team leader, his name was Barack Obama, but we made these decisions and these policy decisions collectively. So when I was meeting with government officials and civil society officials, that was our policy. That wasn't just me, being a cowboy out there in Russia. And in fact, the first time that I traveled to Russia as a US government official, I'd been there many times before, lived several years of my life in Russia, was with President Obama in 2009, July 2009. And he too met with civil society leaders and opposition leaders. So I was just doing the Obama playbook at that time. But by the time I got there, things had changed pretty radically. Putin was running for his third term. There had been massive protests on the streets to protest falsified parliamentary election. And so the context of this, what we call dual track engagement, had changed rather radically. We made a decision to go forward with it because we didn't want to check our values at the door just because things had changed inside of Russia. But I will say there were two things we didn't do. One, we let those people that we were seeking meetings with to decide two things. One, should it be a private meeting or a public meeting? And some chose it to be private, by the way. They did not want their photograph with me or me tweeting out that I just met with this human rights activist. And two, we let them decide where the meeting should be, because there were some that did not think it was in their interest to come to the US Embassy or to come to my residence. It's called Spaso House. And by the way, there were some, including the most famous of them all, his name's Alexei Navalny. He's the leading opposition figure in Russia today, and they tried to kill him last summer by poisoning him, and then he came back and then they arrested him. When I was ambassador, however, I never once met with Mr. Navalny in Russia, not once. And that was because he decided that it was in his interest to not meet with the US ambassador precisely along the lines that you were describing. He just thought that was not in his political interest to do that. Last thing I want to say, though, is it was my job to engage with everybody. It was very important to be nonpartisan. And I think something that's not well understood about my engagement is that most of it was with the Russian government. And when I had people over for dinner parties or to give them cookies, as the Russians used to say, pechenia, State Department cookies, they were called, most of the time, those people were pro-Putin people. And I also went out of my way to engage even with nationalist figures. There's a guy named Zhirinovsky is his name, and he's the head of a very nationalist party. And I was the first ambassador ever to invite him to a 4th of July celebration. And we had the argument that our job was not to play favorites here, but to engage with everybody in Russia.
Understood. And as we discussed the practice of diplomacy and your personal experience with it, there seems to be this common theme of creative problem solving. You invite this individual and not the other ones and try to figure out a nuanced approach to that. What do you think was the most creative approach or maneuver that you proposed or have done during your public service career? Was that the phone call with then Prime Minister Putin about Olympic bids? I found that to be very fascinating.
Well, that one was a bit of a misfire. So, that was 2009. Remember, protocol purposes is that the president should speak to the president, generally not the prime minister. So, but we knew that Putin was very powerful. And so we were always looking for excuses to try to meet with him. When we traveled to Russia, by the way, in July, we had a breakfast meeting with him. But that was only after we met with the president the day before. But yeah, that wasn't my creative idea because he's an expert on Olympics. We were trying to win the Olympic bid. So I convinced Obama to call Putin to get some advice. And he loved the call, by the way. Putin was an expert. He made it very clear to Obama that we had no chance at all of winning the bid. And he was right about that. And he was going into all kinds of details about how he secured their bid for the Sochi Olympics in 2014, the Winter Olympics. But then when we pivoted to policy, he stopped the conversation. He said, well, Mr. President, I'm not in charge of foreign policy anymore. The prime minister is not in charge of that. The president is, but it just so happens that I have the president here. And he handed over the telephone and Medvedev got on the phone. So, that was a kind of funny moment, creative gesture that didn't work. As ambassador, though, I would say two things were creative and different that I experimented with. One was an idea of my boss, and one was my idea. One's a big thing and one's a little thing. The big thing was that I was one of the first ambassadors to use social media in a very regular way. And my boss, Secretary of State Clinton, told me before I went to Moscow, she said, Mike, you have to engage with society, just not the state. And one of the ways you can do that is using social media. And before that conversation, I had never been on Twitter before. It kind of sounded amazing, but I opened my first account when I got to Russia. I am on Twitter now, by the way, so follow me at McFaul. I have a pretty lively Twitter feed these days that I learned from my days in Moscow. But what was right about that is that Twitter, unlike being on TV or radio or even giving a speech, allowed for a back and forth with Russians that they were not accustomed to with the US ambassador. And that opened up a whole way of doing public diplomacy that my predecessors had not done. Two, it allowed me to interact with Russians all over the country, and Russia's the largest country in the world. And had I tried to get to every major city in the world in Russia, I would have spent my entire time as ambassador traveling. But on Twitter, I could get on at night. I only did it off hours. I never was on Twitter during the day, but I would get on during the evening and suddenly be chatting with students in Vladivostok out in Siberia. And so that was a great advantage. And then three, I leveraged, and I learned this from people at the White House that I worked with who worked with Obama, to leverage my personal background as a way to sell and represent America to the Russian people. So I became a bit of a public figure as ambassador. People learned that I was a professor at Stanford, that I had 2 kids, that I coached my son's basketball team. I would talk about these things on Twitter and social media. And I think that was in a very unique way to rebut the claim that I was flown to Russia to support a color revolution. And at one point I became one of the 10 most popular bloggers in Russia because of that. People like those little facts. I went on one day to what would be the equivalent, one of our talk shows at night, right? It's It was the night that Obama was reelected, the day after he was reelected. So millions of viewers. By the way, it's kind of controversial because at that time I was being banned from state television. But this is a light show, talk show, just like our talk shows at night. And you're too young, you guys don't watch them at all anymore. But like Stephen Colbert, if you know who he is, like his show. And I walked on, and as I'm walking on, I'm in my, my diplomatic costume with my red, white, and blue tie and blue suit. And the band, because these night shows, they always have bands, they started playing a Led Zeppelin song. And they had learned that when I was a kid, I was a fan of Led Zeppelin. And it turns out there's millions of Russians, especially in the Cold War days, that really loved Led Zeppelin. So for people my age, that was very popular among Soviet citizens and later Russians. And just that little thing that, people love that. And so those are tools of diplomacy that might not seem intuitive, but were actually very important. And that relates to the one little thing, innovative, that you asked about innovations. It was a small thing, but it was kind of a symbolic thing. It was our first concert at Spaso House. And Spaso House, by the way, is this giant mansion, beautiful place to live. And it has a ballroom that can seat 600 people, right? My whole house in Palo Alto could fit in that ballroom probably. But anyway, it was our first concert. And that's part of public diplomacy, is to host concerts. And it just so happened that the musical group performing was from my home state of Montana. And I was like, wow, what a coincidence. And, so they're going to play country music. And my father was a country music musician before he retired. So that's a world I know well. And I went into the ballroom and I noticed that the chairs were right up to where the performers were going to be. And I asked the person in charge, where's the dance floor? And she turned to me, her name was Olga, and she said, Mr. Ambassador, we don't dance at concerts. That's not what we do here at Spaso House. And I said, well, it's country music and people are going to want to dance. And, when my dad played at gigs, if people didn't dance, that was an insult to these musicians, right? I used to remember him complaining about that. So anyway, we had a long back and forth, and we agreed to take out 2 or 3 rows just on the off chance that people might want to dance. And everybody showed up, and they were all in their suits, and they were all sitting on their hands, and nobody was dancing, just like Olga predicted. And so finally I got up, and with my wife, we danced the 2-step, which is, a dance I learned as a kid. And within 30 seconds, the place had exploded with hundreds of people, Russians, dancing very badly, by the way, because they don't know how to do the 2-step in Russia. But it broke down these barriers between our two societies, because you can do that with music and dance. And it was a really memorable event that, people still talk about. Actually, I was just on a radio program in Russia last week, and it still resonates, that the great McFaul concerts that were a little different than your average ambassadorial concert.
Well, thank you so much, Professor McFaul, for your insights, for being on our program today. I'd like to close by wishing all our viewers good health during this difficult time. Thank you and take care.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Well, yeah.
All right, I got to run. I got to go to another one. That was fun, though.
Bye. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Stay safe. Stay healthy.
Thanks for having me. All right. Bye-bye.
You.
And